Welcome to Down the Garden Path. I'm your host, Joanne Shaw, landscape designer and plant lover. I enjoy discussing down-to-earth tips and advice to help you seasonally manage your garden and landscape, and I also aim to bring you interesting and relevant topics to educate you all about the landscaping and horticultural industry. Welcome to Down the Garden Path. Today we are going to talk about hydrangeas, and more specifically, what do you do when they don't work and they're not performing? What's going on with your hydrangeas? So I've noticed a lot of um, posts and comments and stuff in social media about what's wrong with my hydrangea or what am I doing wrong. So I thought we'd do a little short show about what might be going on with your hydrangea and how you can fix it or how you can maybe not worry about it. So thank you for joining me here on Down the Garden Path. This episode is brought to you by Down to Earth Landscape Design. I'm Joanne Shaw with Down to Earth Landscape Design, and I'm a landscape designer that can help you if you live in eastern part of the GTA in Ontario, Canada, or we can do virtual design. So you can reach out to me and we can talk about virtual design. So now let's get back to hydrangeas. So one of the top complaints is what's going wrong. My hydrangea is not blooming. I've been fertilizing, I've been watering, I think it gets enough sun. What's going on? Well, before we start talking about really specifics on what's going on with your hydrangea, it's important to know what type of hydrangea you have. There are, I would say, common Macrophylla. That one is blooms on old wood, and it's very similar to the Easter hydrangea that many people get at Easter time. Then there's the Paniculata, my personal favorite variety that blooms on new wood. And then you have the oak leaf hydrangea, which blooms on old wood as well. And the smooth or arborescence hydrangea, like the Annabelle or Incredible hydrangea. And then there's one called mountain hydrangea or Serrata. So it's a little less known, but it's closely related to or closely similar to the Macrophylla hydrangea, but it is a little bit more hardy. So, okay, so now let's say you know what variety you have, so we can talk about what's going on. So, like I said, the Macrophylla, I think that's the one that most people struggle with getting to bloom. And that is because it is a greenhouse grown, especially the Easter ones that you get as a gift, or the ones that can go from, you can change the soil and go from pink to purple. They can be tough to grow and to get to bloom because they bloom on the old wood. So you leave the old stems, and then we get a late frost in our area. Depending on where you live, you may or may not. But if we do get a late frost, then those buds that are starting to form on that old wood get killed. So it still leaves out, it still takes your fertilizer, it still becomes a big lush plant, but there's no blooms. Or maybe by this time of year, at the end of the season, you've got 2 or 3 blooms and you're like, oh, it finally bloomed, so I'll hold on to it for another year. Maybe it'll be better next year. Well, chances are it may and it may not. So I have to say that I had 12 of those in my garden at one point, and I just gave up and I decided to switch over to more of the Paniculata and the Annabelle and Arborescence and the oak leaf hydrangea because I just have only so much space in my garden, and I definitely wanted hydrangeas to bloom. And I love hydrangeas. So I have 5 different varieties in my garden, and I wish I could have more. Actually, I think I forgot. I actually have 6 because I have the little Annabelles. So yeah, so that is a common situation. The other ones, if you're not, the other issue is that you might be pruning at the wrong time. So if you pruned something, if you pruned, let's say an Annabelle hydrangea late in the season to tidy it up, or any of your other Paniculata hydrangeas to tidy them up, and now you're noticing there's just a few blooms. The problem is that the season, because it blooms on new wood, you've got to wait for that plant to have all the energy to grow new wood and then set the buds and the flowers on that new wood. So the cycle is longer. So I do recommend, if you have to prune your paniculata, then doing it more early in the season when the plant is still technically dormant, like March. I tend to wait till the ground is a little bit easy to drier in March. I'm not going to step in snow or wet soil, but I try to wait for those warmer days near the end of March, and that's when I do, if I need to do any pruning on my paniculatas. And really, I only do trimming on my limelight, and that's to control size, which we'll talk about shortly. So the rest of them should be blooming no problem by this point in the season. So if they're a little bit less than they were in the past, then that's something to consider about when did you prune it or when did you cut it back, and if you did or didn't. Also, keep in mind the weather. So every season we're hit with something else. This year we've hit with some extremes, and I think the extremes will continue um, in the near future with our climate. So we will get, really rainy times, and we will get really hot, and it will fluctuate. And I know that has affected my that if like inconsistent water can affect some of the plants. So I've noticed that with Bobo, and I've noticed that with my oak leaf hydrangea, that if the water it hasn't been consistent, then they do flower, but the flowers quickly go brown and they don't stay the nice white that I want them to stay for as much of the season as possible. So if you are finding that you have some of your hydrangeas that are quickly browning or really going to fall color midsummer, then that could be, it's not like you're watering them, but it's inconsistent. And sometimes I think we think, well, after a good rain, oh, now I don't need to water. But some of these rains we've had lately have been so powerful and so fast that after quite a bit of drought, that I think a lot of the water actually just runs right off our gardens and doesn't really absorb. So those plants you thinking have gotten water, but they may not have. So I do recommend, if you're curious about that, then do some a little bit digging, poking. Sometimes I always tell my clients to take an old wooden spoon, go buy a new wooden spoon from the dollar store, and use an old one to push that down into the soil and just see how wet is your soil around your plants, especially your hydrangeas, because they do, hydra being in their name, they do require a good amount of consistent water. They can go through drought for short periods of time, but I do feel that then you start to see some suffering, whether it's in the flower or in the leaves of the plant. So yeah. So another complaint I'm hearing is sometimes that, and I don't know if this is always a problem, but my hydrangeas are too big. They've gotten too big. They are crowding out my other plants, or they've outgrown their space. So this goes back to pruning. So knowing when to prune and when not to prune. And that also goes back to knowing the type of hydrangea you have, so that you know whether it's blooming on old wood or new wood. And that tells you when you should be pruning them to control the size. One of the biggest ones, I think limelight is one that does get is very woody. And then by year 3 or 4, it can get, start exceeding the 6 foot, 7 foot size. And I like to control it by pruning it. And you can prune it pretty hard. I think March is the best time, as I already mentioned, to prune it hard. And then, but know that it still needs to grow stems, and then the buds will come from those new stems, hence the new growth. So you really need to, it will continue to get large. So it might be something you have to do every March. I know I started off having to do it every few years. And then when it really started to fill out, I needed to do it now every winter. So yeah, so that is important. Annabelle hydrangeas often get accused of being too big and sometimes too floppy. So I'll kill two birds with one stone here, where I talk about that. And I really think it's important to deadhead and not cut, because the Annabelle hydrangea has a really weak, for some reason, the stem when it grows new, it's not woody. It's much weaker than the other varieties of hydrangea. So then the stem doesn't support the bloom, which seems kind of weird, but it's true. So I try to just deadhead my hydrangeas, my Annabelle hydrangeas in the spring, and whether you do it in the fall or the spring, you can leave them not, not remove the heads, but still do some strategic pruning in the fall if you want to. But I like to leave it all to the spring. Even though they bloom on new wood, I like to leave as much old wood up as possible so that it helps support the plant, so it's not so floppy. So that's something you can do. So just think about strategically if you do need to prune it back, and create that green, much greener stem, that new growth, that you're just doing it 1/3 at a time, as opposed to doing all of it at the same time. So you can go in strategically, and every other year you can see where you pruned a couple years ago, and you can see which stems are getting thicker and which ones need to be cut, that type of thing. So that will really help. It's not a quick fix, it's something that you do over time. But I think if you stop cutting it back to the ground immediately, that will solve the problem for sure. And I, for one, am not fond of having to, add a peony cage or add string or add stakes to kind of prop up the plant. I think we should be following as much as we can proper pruning procedures in order for the plant to just be its best. There's nobody staking up anything out in the forest or that type of thing. So I think we should just do what we should do properly, and then the plant will do well. Sometimes I know with my peonies, which also can be accused, I know it's not a peony talk, it's a hydrangea talk, but sometimes people find that about their peonies, that they can be very floppy. And my answer for that is actually planting the garden a little tighter around a peony, which does have a negative side effect. So we'll talk about that in the peony show. But when, if there's a hedge or if there's other plants nearby, then the plant can rest on those, and they aren't as floppy and they aren't on the ground, especially after a rain or wind. So that can be the same with hydrangeas. I love a hydrangea behind a hedge. I find the hedge, hides the bottom, not so attractive part of a hydrangea, and also helps to create a framework to support them, especially Annabelles that can be a little bit weaker stemmed. Both the Paniculata, the Serrata, and the oak leaf hydrangeas, Quercifolia, are pretty strong stems, so they don't really need a lot of support. So that is good. The Macrophylla, they can also be a little floppy, and especially if you've get fertilized a lot, the leaves and everything can kind of be a little bit more floppy from that standpoint. So March is a good time to do it. The other thing about size is maybe a time of purchase you really need to consider and look for a smaller variety to keep in mind. So there are, compared to when I started out in the industry, there's so many more beautiful hydrangeas that actually come in small packages, which is great. So if you like the limelight, maybe at a previous house you had the space and you could grow a nice big large limelight, then that's great. But if now you don't, or you know someone who has a smaller space, then you can look for little lime or bobo, both smaller hydrangeas that still perform really, really well. Even the oak leaf, my oak leaf hydrangea is very large and really can only do it if you have a large amount of space, but you can get smaller varieties of oak leaf hydrangeas as well. Munchkin is one variety, as well as peewee oak leaf hydrangea. So those are two options if you're looking for smaller ones. Or I think the quantity is better. So I'd rather get a whole bunch more of the dwarf varieties. So I have more varieties in my garden, which is why I have 6 varieties. Annabelle, same thing. It can be really big. But if you look for Invincible Wee White or Invincible Limetta, they are smaller. And they still have a long-lasting flower, that lime green flower head that will turn pink and copper later on in the season. And they're much more compact. Wee White is smaller than Limetta. But that's something to consider for, especially, shade gardens. Sometimes they're pretty small, or even if it is big shade garden, then instead of just putting one large Annabelle in, you can maybe put 3 of the Limettas in the garden. So, and I do know I have 3 in a garden, a part sun garden of mine, but the one of the 3 gets virtually no sun because it's kind of farther at the back and other plants have kind of overgrown it. But it is the largest of the 3, which I find interesting. So that's something. So look for smaller varieties. So the little lime, Quick fire, firelight, they can be big hydrangeas, but there's little quick fire, which I tend to like as well. Those ones get pink a little bit faster, but they're still Paniculata hydrangea as opposed to a Macrophylla hydrangea. Um, yeah, so there you go. So if I think consistent water, proper pruning, and proper location. So really pay attention to the light that they're getting and looking at, other plants that might have grown up in the way, or if they're reaching, I had to remove some of my limelights because they were now being shaded as other trees around them grew up, and they were really leaning. They were leaning over the hedge into the walkway because they were leaning for the sun. So step back this time of year when hydrangeas are shining like stars in your garden, or should be shining like stars in your garden, and take a look at what's going on and if you need to make any changes. And please reach out. I'm happy to discuss it. Please send me a picture. You can always do that. Log on to Facebook and join the Down the Garden Path podcast Facebook group. And that's a perfectly great place for you to reach out to me and ask me any questions or post any pictures so that I can help you and maybe help you locate a better variety of hydrangea or an additional variety of hydrangea for your garden. My previous host and I, Matthew, we did a 2 or 3 part series on hydrangeas a couple years ago. So I'll definitely have that link to those in the show notes if you want to do a deeper dive on each of those hydrangeas. And I just want to thank everybody for joining me down the garden path. Enjoy your hydrangeas this time of year because they are putting on a show. And please leave them up for the winter and enjoy the winter interest, and then do some light deadheading. And that includes one thing we didn't talk about was the hydrangea standards. So those are ones that are more grown on a tree trunk, and then the blooms are higher above. And they're a really great, perfect thing to add to a garden, more of an ornamental tree. But they too will look really lovely in the winter with their dried flower heads on, with a little bit of snow on them, that type of thing. And then in the spring, you just give them a little haircut by trimming off and deadheading the flower heads, and then they'll be right back. And if you are wanting to compact the size, much like the regular Paniculata limelight, you would do the same thing. You would go out in March and then cut it back hard and wait for it to fill out. So yeah. So again, love the plants. My variety, just so if anybody's curious, so I have little quickfire, oak leaf, hydrangea, Bobo, Limelight, and Annabelle. And well, actually, I swatched them out for the new Incredible variety because I wanted to see how they would perform. And I have Wee White as well, Annabelle variety, Arborescence, Invincible Wee White hydrangea. So I'm really excited about those. And I've really enjoyed them in my garden. So I hope to hear from you and see if you've got a favorite. I don't have any mountain Serrata planted, so that might be my next purchase if I can find a spot for it. But I'd love to hear what your favorites are and why, or help you with any problems you might have. So thanks again for joining me down the garden path, and we'll see you next time. Bye for now.